Let's now continue the previous example where we have looked into different data sets. Now everything works perfectly in the collection runner, but if you're inside Postman and you want to make some changes or to run the individual requests one by one, you will actually see that the information that we sent out for customer ID and product ID, they are not filled with anything. So it will just contain the marker, but these variables don't actually exist here. And this is because we have used here data variables in the collection runner, but otherwise customer ID and product ID are not defined anywhere. And this makes it a bit harder to define data externally, but at the same time not to have this data in Postman so that you can still have like a very simple working example without providing this external file. And I wanted to show you a way on how we can make the same request work in Postman without providing this external data set for the most basic example that you want to have it, but at the same time to have it available when using the collection runner or Newman with the external data set. And if you remember, in Postman, there are different variable scopes. And what we can do now is that we can define collection variables. And if there's no external data file, then the collection variables will be used. And if a collection data file is provided, then the data variables from that external file will override the collection variables, because you will see their scope is much narrower than the collection files. So let's go inside our collection and define a couple of variables. So let's take, for example, customer ID. So what we will do is, in order management, I'm going to edit the collection and go to the variables tab and write here customer ID. And let's say this will be 100. And the same goes with product ID. Let's say this is 200. And send the request again. Now the request is properly working, so we are now sending this information here, 100 and 200. But we have some failing tests. And now let's go ahead and see how we can fix those tests as well. Now, as you remember, we have this iteration data, and the data set that we provided here was actually valid. We have this is valid, and this comes directly from the iteration data. So here we have used double curly brackets, and Postman does it automatically for us. It looks which scope is appropriate for this case. So it will go scope by scope, go to the collection variables, will look, oh, customer ID is defined, and going to the next scopes, it will not find anything else. So this is why customer ID will get picked up here. But inside tests, it goes directly to iteration data and saying, is there anything inside where you have is valid? No. Okay, then this will not be executed. So what we will do here is to define another collection variable called is valid. I'm gonna say this data set is valid is true. So the value that we have here is actually true. And instead of iteration data, let's simply use variables. Now, as you remember, pm.variables.get, this is the scoped getter in Postman, which means it doesn't matter where you have defined your variable. It can be a global, it can be an environment, collection, data, whatever. It will look which is the proper scope for this variable, similar to the double curly brackets, and it will pick up this value. So now this variable is defined, and we still have to replace this other variable. So everywhere where it says iteration data, we just have to go with pm.variables. And our tests are still failing because we are comparing numbers with strings. This is something that can happen in Postman. If you ever have this error, all you have to do is parse that respective string as a number so that it works. I'm going to use parse int for that. And we are all set. Our collection now works in Postman. And let's go to the collection run and see if it still works the way we expect it to work. And everything works as before. We still have this iteration data that we have previously defined, and none of the data that we have defined inside the collection will get picked up because data variables have a much narrower scope and then they will get picked up. This is how you can maintain your collection in Postman to have some valid information there, but at the same time use it with the collection runner. Now there's a final thing I wanted to show you. So far we have really picked up this data which is more or less static. So you have this information, customer ID, we defined a value, put it here. Product ID, we have defined this value, put it there. But sometimes you need to define an even more larger product, and this can get a bit complicated. But let me show you a very simple example on how you can do it. So let's say with our order, we have to provide some additional information as well. Let's say this is the meta information that we need to submit. Meta info. And this itself is an object. So let's say it contains a category ID. Let's say it contains a segment ID. And let's say it contains some keywords as well. Okay, so as you can see, putting this information on the same line again with the other information that we already have can get even more complicated. So let's first put this additional data in our iteration. Now, what I'll do in this case is I will add this meta information here. So this will be one case where I'm providing this information. But for example, meta information can be, let's say, null, that I don't provide it. But it can also have different values. And I can define here really complex nested objects. And what I'm trying to do is to take this information here as it is and put it inside Postman. Now the idea would be to replace everything that we have here with a single variable so that we do not have to manage so many variables. So this will be meta info. But we need to do some additional step as well, because this will be a JavaScript object and we actually need to provide a JSON object here. So what we'll do here is the following. You're going to define a local variable, and that can be done with pm.variables.get. The information that I'm grabbing comes from the iteration data. So pm.iteration.data.get. And next what we need to do is transform this JavaScript object into a JSON string. So for that, we're going to use JSON.stringify as a method. So let's go back to the collection runner and see if this worked. Now, if we're looking at a create order request in the request body, we'll be able to see that meta info has now this entire information that we have defined there. So this is how you can even send complex objects with Postman and define, using these data sets, really complex JSON objects, send them over the wire in this case, make assertions in them, and see how everything plays together.